Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Bloom Conversations. I'm Clare Dewhirst. I'm the Director of City Nation Place, which is the global forum for place branding and place marketing. I'm honoured that Bloom Consulting has invited me to join these podcast sessions just to introduce the discussions. I see my job as asking the questions on behalf of you to ensure that we learn the most from the Bloom experts and their guest speakers. This podcast series has been launched to celebrate Bloom's 20th anniversary. Happy birthday, Bloom. And throughout the series, we'll be diving into the world of nation branding and place branding. In each episode, we'll be looking at just one thing you could focus on to improve your nation or place brand strategy. In fact, in each episode, we'll be focusing on one of the 14 steps that Bloom have identified as being crucial to building an effective strategy. So just one thing today and 14 things over the series of conversations.
So welcome back, everybody, to the Bloom Conversation podcast series. In our previous episodes, we have covered all 14 of Bloom's steps to nation branding. In this episode is a concluding conversation, and I'm delighted to have with me both José Torres, who is the Chief Executive at Bloom, and Keith Dinnie, who is the President of Bloom Consulting. Welcome, both of you. Lovely to see you both. And also what I have with me are some questions that have been sent in via LinkedIn from people who've been listening to the series, which is great. They're going to encourage José and Keith and me to take the conversation a little bit further and to look at some of the broader issues around nation and place branding. So are you ready for your questions, José and Keith? Shall we kick off?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, so the first question that we had come through was about convincing policymakers and politicians of the value of nation branding. One of the key words in this question is the long term. We know that politicians like to win votes, but how can we convince our political leaders that nation branding is something you have to be in for the long term and that it has a value over the long term? Who shall I come to first? Shall I come to you, José?
Yes, by all means. Well, Claire, I think this is a crucial question and a question that we are actually asked many times on the projects and when we're working on nation brand projects, or even before we start working on nation brand projects, or by our listeners. So one of the key things, Claire, that you are very well aware of, because City Nation Place was also part of this, was the economic impact on nation brands on the local economy and also on city brands. And if you recall, the conclusion of that study, which was the first in our sector, as you know, was that the perception, the reputation of countries and cities, they do have an impact on the economy. So we know that on the rough average, we're talking about a 25% impact on the economy. So we're saying that specifically on the attraction of tourism, investment, and talent, which we all know that's not nation branding, but that the nation brand has an impact on these transactions. And this is very important for countries because in the end, you are investing most of the time and money, and then this shows there is a return on that investment. This is one of the most important arguments, very tangible and scientifically demonstrated and proven. And I think this would be one of my main arguments.
Yes, and we've seen, as you and I have shared that research, José, with people in the City Nation Place community, we've seen places using that research and using that hard economic impact to achieve or retain budgets for their place branding work. So it obviously does have sway. But I guess there's another problem here, and maybe Keith, you might have something to say about this, which is the misconception that politicians and people outside of the place branding world have of what place branding or nation branding is. And particularly politicians, they do like a new logo, don't they? They do like a new ad campaign. It makes them feel very good. So how do we show them that it's something more than that, do you think, Keith?
Yeah, that's a great question, Claire, that you'd asked. If the policymakers and politicians don't buy in to place branding, then not much is going to happen. I think partly it's a question of education, and that was actually the motivation for me to write my nation branding book, published in 2007. At that time, when I was researching nation branding, it was pretty clear to me that most policymakers and politicians just did not understand place branding at all, but they were spending public money, taxpayers' money, usually on advertising campaigns that were really having no impact whatsoever. There was no continuity, there was no brand building. It was just kind of ad hoc, fragmentary activities that really, contributing nothing to the nation brand. So just kind of informing and engaging with policymakers and politicians to make sure they realize it's not just a logo, it's not just a slogan, it's not just advertising, that's important. But for education to work, that there's got to be a willingness to kind of be available to that. And obviously politicians are very focused on their own survival as politicians, their government's survival. So it's very easy for nation branding to drop down their list of priorities. So I think it's kind of a combination of education, also kind of making it clear to politicians that if they don't take a proactive approach to managing the nation brand, then their country is going to be completely at the mercy of global media and whatever narratives are being pushed by global media and also by social media. So being passive and just hoping things will be okay, that's really not a kind of an acceptable approach. I just make one final point in this respect to get politicians on board. You have to make it as easy and painless as possible for them to be part of the place branding, whether that's nation branding, city branding, or region branding. Politicians, if they don't have a background in branding, they're not naturally going to be lenient to this kind of stuff. So it's necessary for nation branding teams to construct the campaign in such a way that the politicians, in some ways, all they need to do is show up. If you have a trade event somewhere, you've got a delegation going out, just make it very straightforward for senior politicians to be part of that without them having to spend days wondering, what do I need to say here? Basically, put it on a plate for the politicians so it's as simple as possible for them to engage.
Yeah, I hear you. That makes perfect sense. One of the things that we've talked about in the past episodes when we've covered the steps is we know that the narrative needs to be authentic and reflect that place. And that's all well and good when everything that's happening in that place, that country is a positive story. Obviously, you want the positive stories. I mean, one of the questions that's come through from one of the listeners is around the reconstruction of a country brand after a period of violence. This question actually references Ukraine. The Ukraine brand team have never stopped promoting their nation brand and allying it to their values to gain global support in their fight against Russia. They're also thinking about the rebuilding of Ukraine, and they'll want to put other messages into that. It references Sydney and Haiti and the Sahel countries. After a war or after a disaster, what role can country branding play and how do you rebuild the image of a country? Have you got any thoughts around that, José?
Yes, definitely. So I believe that the approach should be exactly or should not be different to any other nation branding process. I think it should be exactly the same. You should have the same principles. Of course, you're not going to have the same tactics. The tactic is different, but the approach is the same. So the logic is the same. If you remember, Claire, one of the steps we have is to create realistic objectives. So you need to understand what is the objective of the nation brand initiative, right? So depending on the country, depending on the city, you need to set those objectives. But the process should be the same. You should approach it the same way, as should not be any difference to any other nation brand initiative. And you say, well, can you go back to some examples and say, well, just look into history. And one of the things that our audiences need to understand better is that this takes time, right? So this is something that takes time. This is something you cannot have a quick win, a quick fix, and so on. And alluding to what Keith said about leaving this to the mercy of third parties if you don't have an initiative. Today, this is actually a risk factor. We have one of the steps we talk about mitigation of risks, right? But today, there's kind of a fight in terms of violence towards nations. There's already a violence towards narratives that actually attack nations. Some of the nation brands are already on crisis mode. They have to put this into their risk mitigation factors. This was not seen or is relatively new over the last 5 years and also came from the global conflicts as we are seeing today. This is more, it used to happen in 1 or 2 countries, but now it's an attack to all of them some of the times. And you're seeing this, and our data is showing that you have this more and more violent, and the fake news and the deep fakes and with AI and the altered images, it's very difficult to validate the information that reaches you. So again, this is thanks to technology and the current geopolitical situation, but countries need to pay attention to that because they are being attacked with false narratives and information that is not correct and is very difficult. And this affects their brand. Countries and cities, especially countries, need to pay special attention to this today, more so than they did 5 years ago.
Yeah, as Keith said earlier, it's about controlling the narrative. Otherwise, there's going to be a narrative going on anyway. That's why it's important to have a nation brand strategy, I guess, as Ukraine have proved, even during a time of conflict. Yes.
Exactly. I would even say more than controlling is contributing to the narrative, because you cannot control the narrative, right? You also want to have a say to what is being said.
Interesting, subtle but important difference. Keith, what do you have to add to that? What do you think are the tools that a country can use as they're coming out of a disaster or a time of conflict to reinforce the narrative that they want to contribute to the global discussion?
I would agree with José that the fundamentals are the same in building a brand. There needs to be a logical process, lots of stakeholder engagement, and kind of develop it that way. You mentioned Ukraine a couple of times, and I would say the way that President Zelensky presents himself on the global stage, visiting different countries in person, and what's very noticeable in his appearances is that his message is very much tailored to the countries he's in. So it'll be quite a different message in France compared to the United States, compared to the UK. And I think there's a real lesson there for other political leaders who don't really showcase or represent their country in the same way. Also in terms of modulating the message to different international markets. Some nation branding is still very kind of clunky. There's one message, and that message is projected, with no cultural sensitivity to other international markets. And I'm just thinking of a couple of examples of countries that have suffered violence. If you look at Croatia, tourism offers one kind of sector that can quite quickly emerge from that kind of scenario, which Croatia's proved. And we're actually seeing it right now with Lebanon. So obviously there's this huge problem still, economically, politically, socially. But it seems the tourism sector is coming back to life. And that can be, it's obviously the tourism sector is not the whole nation brand, but it can be in the vanguard of readjusting global perceptions in a more positive direction.
It's very interesting that you should reference tourism, Keith. One of the other questions from listeners of previous episodes was, how can destinations differentiate themselves in an increasingly competitive tourism market through nation branding? So I guess that's a question not just about running a tourism campaign that stands out from the crowd, but how having a nation brand strategy behind your tourism messaging can give it extra heft or extra weight. Any ideas, any examples you can think of there? I'll start with Keith, because you mentioned tourism as something that's helped.
Yeah, I think this leads us into soft power, which we haven't really mentioned yet. The whole kind of resource of culture, history, everything the country has in that respect is incredibly powerful and often underused in terms of creating an authentic tourism brand that's part of the overall nation brand. I would be looking for countries to really look at their own culture and celebrate much more their food and drink, their gastronomy. Some countries obviously do this very well. Kind of France, Italy, Thailand, Japan have all had food as a core part of the nation branding for several years. You look at some other countries which have their own riches in that part of their culture, and they don't celebrate it at all. I would say more focus on food and drink culture and also music. I mean, I was just reading Clare, City Nation Place has got a very interesting article on the role of sound in place branding. Why are countries not making more use of sound? And music is the obvious element there, but it's not just music. It's also languages, accents, ambient sounds in cities and in rural areas. Very, very powerful. And there's a whole field of sonic branding, which corporations are becoming increasingly aware of. But I would still suggest that many places have been slow to pick up on the potential power of sound to build their place brands.
Yeah. Oh, and thank you for referencing that article. I agree with you. I think it is a missed opportunity, although we've seen a few great award entries, hence the article. José, I'll come to you on that one. How does your nation brand support your tourism marketing?
Yeah, and I think it's important to highlight again the differentiation between nation branding and nation marketing, right? Nation branding is indeed one of the parts that Keith was talking about the soft power, and it's really about changing perception. This is the goal when we talk about nation branding. The objective of nation branding is not to sell anything specifically. It's to build a perception, to build an idea in the minds of stakeholders, so that later on you can take those ingredients, and as Keith was mentioning, and use it from a nation marketing perspective, and which is when you promote the country or the city, because we talk about city branding as well. So this is applicable for the same. They are intertwined, but you cannot start building just purely a promotion and say, come to this beautiful country because it's wonderful, and whatever the angle we would like to go from a nation marketing perspective, if in the heads of those audiences there's a misperception or a negative perception towards the place, and therefore then doesn't matter what you say, you're not going to be able to attract the tourists to go there. Nevertheless, these are two things that sometimes the content from the left can go to the right. When I say left, I mean nation branding. On the right, go to nation marketing, because we have a diagram that shows this. If you go to our journal, aside from the 14 steps, you're going to find a lot of information about nation branding and nation marketing. Our listeners can download and read this. But it's very important to highlight the two, and that they have different functions, and also the different stakeholders managing those, right? So this is something that we need to be more. And this is just to complement what Keith was saying, because I agreed with everything that you mentioned. And that's my take.
From every conversation we have, there has to be at least one thing that I take away. And although that's something I knew, it's really helpful to hear that so clearly articulated, that the nation brand or the city brand, the place brand, is just about changing perceptions, and the marketing is more transactional. I think that separation might help those destination marketers, investment promotion agencies that come to City Nation Place, and where the conversation sometimes gets confused in their mind. I mean, this sounds like such a huge challenge, doesn't it? To contribute to the narrative about your country or your city or your region. It sounds like something that you want politicians to have bought into, and something which might have huge budgets associated with it. So I think this is a really interesting question that came through as well. How can emerging economies develop a strong nation brand without the historical or financial capital that larger nations have? I mean, I'm guessing you're going to say they've still got that historical capital, but it's just people didn't know about it. So I guess really the question here is, what can you do that's low cost, or what are the resources that you can look to, which mean that you don't have to get a massive budget signed off for your nation or city or regional brand strategy?
So this is something that it doesn't, of course you need budget, of course you need resources to develop, like any other type of activity, any type of initiatives that concerns a nation. And so there needs to be always a minimum that you need to invest and have capital allocated. This could be in the form of creating a fund, coming from a form of contribution from other different stakeholders, public or private. We're not here to discuss financial models, because that's another aspect. It's not because you're going to have more money that you're going to have a better perception. And actually, you would be surprised with the nations that have a very good perception, they have actually very limited budgets. So this is something that is interesting to address. More importantly, and I think it's clear to understand, because normally it's seen as, yes, and we need a big budget to create a big promotion. Again, we come back to the points and the misconceptions of what nation branding is. And if you imagine you have $1 trillion to invest in a media campaign, and you just populate Times Square that everyone knows and has a mental image of, and imagine if you'd see a campaign every day for 1 month saying the opposite of what you believe about that country. You're not going to change your mind just because you're going to have messages saying wonderful things about the country. You will not change the image you have about the country. So it's not a matter of budget. It's a matter of intelligence about the types of tools you have. It's not about advertising. I'm not excluding marketing, and there's comms associated with that. It's about public opinion. And we talk about this because you say, how do you change perception? You change perception in two ways: influence and experience. Influence is peer-to-peer, the conversation we're having here. If I talk about the country, or with my friends and family, or when I listen about the specific country, I'm being indirectly influenced by that country and building an opinion. Or what I read, especially digital, is very important. And, when we talk about nation branding and place branding 2.0, it's really about the digital identity. This is something that we talked about since 2019, how important it is to shape that perception. The one with the stronger narrative, or the participation of that narrative, that presence, is really going to benefit from that from a perception point of view. And that, the budget sometimes is zero. Nevertheless, you need structure, you need strategy, you need to have people writing and talking and so on. So it's not a matter of budget, but of intelligence, competence, new technologies, and so on. The experience is more tricky because when you put your boots on the ground, immediately your perception improves. 90% of the cases, this is the situation. Normally, there's always a big gap between perception and reality. The perception is always worse than the reality. With the exception of the top 10 nation brands, this is what happens. When you go, sometimes it happens the other way around. On those top 10, you have a very good perception. You go there and then suddenly you get more disappointed. Like the perception decreases because the reality is not as wonderful as you had it in your mind, right? But there was an image, right? But normally speaking, especially on the countries that don't have a positive perception, you go there and immediately your perception improves. But of course, you cannot make everyone travel to that country to change the perceptions. But there's also another aspect on the experience, which is when you consume a product from that country specifically. So, oh, this country has a wonderful product, or I wonder what that is, and so on. Or even when you have a professional experience with someone from that specific country. Those are factors that change perceptions. And to conclude, really what this is about, and again, I say there's no need for budget from a promotional point of view, but you need budget to actually help nations, but also cities, to implement policies aligned with how you want to be perceived. This is what we call the walk the talk. It's not just the talk, it's, you need to walk and then you talk about the walk. It's really about understanding these touch points that we have actually on our step 8, which we talk about normally, that you need to focus on stakeholders to make sure that they are aligned with the brand, the strong governance associated. You need to have then the policies, which are touch points aligned with the brand. Then the digital, and last but not least comes the marketing, not from a purely promotional point of view, but the strategic one. These are the 4 areas you have to work on. And most of the times, this is really done by third parties, not the nation brand institutions. They are the ones that deliver and make those touch points a reality, and sometimes even the private sector. And that's it.
I have some thoughts, but I'm going to save them until after Keith has answered the question as well. I mean, there's kind of 2 questions there. The emerging economies and perhaps those places with smaller budgets. What advice would you give to them, Keith?
Yeah, I would refer to UK government's Great campaign, which, just to be clear, it is called the Great Campaign. That's the official name. And I think it's well established. Overall, it's been very successful and is an example for countries to look at. However, they don't have a huge budget.
I can attest to that. We have an advisory group that meets once a month online, all of the leaders of different place organizations around the world. And often when we're discussing all sorts of issues, the question of budget comes up. And I mean, just the differences really between budgets is huge and has no reflection on the size of the place. I mean, some of the cities in the United States, for example, they have a budget triple times that of one of the nation brand teams in the group, probably, in fact, several of the nation brand teams in the group. And they're kind of apologizing because they don't think they have so much money. But, compared to a brand team, they do. We published a report on structure and governance, actually, which included information on funding and benchmarking on funding. And it does seem that the place brand teams, the nation brand committees, the city brand teams, always have much, much smaller budgets than the destination marketing organizations or economic development or investment promotion agencies. And it makes sense. They don't need to be the people that pay for the marketing campaign. They need their budget for the research and the creative work and the measurement and the expertise, but not for expensive marketing campaigns.
Anyway, I interrupted. Sorry, Keith.
It's absolutely right. And I can absolutely believe that the UK Great Campaign budget is lower than some smaller European countries. But I would say the Great Campaign is getting more bang for its buck than a lot of other campaigns. One thing they do, and this would be useful for emerging countries or any country where there's not a huge budget available, the Great Campaign's been very active in partnering with industry partners, British Airways, Cadbury, a whole range of British brands. They have an advisory council from industry which helps enable these deals. So that can exponentially increase the impact of what you're doing. The fact is, big corporations have far bigger budgets than almost any nation branding team is ever going to have direct access to from their own government. Engaging with the private sector can be very effective for any country. More broadly, José mentioned stakeholders and alignment in the nation brand, but also active engagement, because there will be a lot of creativity, a lot of ideas, a lot of influential networks that are available from citizens in the country. I would suggest that not many countries are very good at activating these citizen networks. I think that would be something that a lot of countries could look into. And specifically at nation branding level, there's lots that can be done by embassies. So embassy outreach programs. Again, there's huge variation. Some countries are very, very active and they have very kind of structured programs to engage with local audiences. And this is when we get into kind of public diplomacy, soft power again. Whereas other countries are so passive to the point that they're doing almost nothing at all. There's also quite a variation depending on the personality of the ambassador. If you've got an ambassador in place who is committed to nation branding, who understands it, who believes in it, then that embassy can become hyperactive for that country. But on the other hand, if you have an ambassador who is more kind of old school and takes the view that, public diplomacy, soft power, these are kind of peripheral activities, then not much is going to happen through the embassy. So if there can be a culture developed whereby diplomats at all level within an embassy are actually encouraged to share their ideas and their creativity, I think you could unleash a lot of positive developments, even if the budget is not huge.
Yeah. I remember we had Guri Hoggard from the Faroe Islands speak at the Americas conference once, and they have, they have award-winning campaigns coming out of the Faroe Islands, which is not a huge place. And she was asked what she thought the secret to her success was. She said, our budgets are really small. And if you don't have a huge amount of money, you have to think creatively and also use your own community, use your own team who really know your place. Well, I think we're kind of out of time. If I was going to sum up anything from this call, it would be that all things are possible, but you need to put a lot of thought into approaching things in a structural way, and then your budget will go further and you will be using your taxpayers' money to the best of your ability. And Bloom's 14 Steps of Nation Branding are a fantastic guide in order to think about that structured approach to your place branding. José has a comment to add to that, I'm sure.
Indeed, it's important what you have highlighted, Claire, and that you can download this from our website, bloom-consulting.com. But what I would like to say is this is our last session or last podcast together, and I would like to thank you in the name of Bloom for hosting our podcast series, these podcast series. It has been a lot of fun. I did not know we would have to spend so
2
many
years.
exactly writing about it. It was the anniversary of Bloom, and I would like to say that it has been an absolute pleasure, and you moderating all of these sessions brought immense value. Thank you so much for that, and in my personal name, thank you so much, Claire. It was wonderful to have you in all these sessions, and who knows, more to come.
Maybe. It's been a pleasure, José. We've had some really good conversations. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. I think that's it. I think I'm going to thank José and Keith for joining us today and answering those questions and giving us such food for thought. Thank you, everybody who's been listening to the podcast. Over and out.
Thank you.